December 8th, 1941. 11:20 p.m. Tokyo time. Just hours after the first wave struck Pearl Harbor, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo emerged from his private meeting with Emperor Hirohito, his face composed, his uniform immaculate. Vice Interior Minister Michio Yuzawa stood nearby, moved by the gravity of the moment. Tojo turned to him and made a declaration that would echo through the conference rooms and command centers of Tokyo for exactly 4 months. "I'm perfectly relieved," Tojo said, his voice carrying the weight of divine approval. "You can say we have already won, given the current situation." The attack hadn't even begun when these words were spoken. Not a single bomb had fallen. Not one torpedo had struck its target. Yet, Japan's leader had already claimed victory. 3,000 miles away, in the pre-dawn darkness aboard the flagship Nagato, not everyone shared his confidence. What Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood in that moment, and what Tokyo's celebrating generals would take weeks to discover, would determine the fate of the entire Pacific War. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Before we begin, let the weight of today settle. Whether it brought victories worth celebrating or challenges that tested you, let it all rest now. Tonight, we're traveling back to December 1941, to a moment when champagne flowed through Tokyo's halls of power while one admiral stood alone in darkness, calculating a truth no one else wanted to see. It's a story about celebration and mathematics, about triumph and the invisible countdown clock that began ticking the moment the first bomb fell. The Imperial General Headquarters occupied a reinforced complex beneath the War Ministry building in central Tokyo. Its conference rooms, insulated from the outside world by concrete and protocol, hummed with energy on the morning of December 8th that hadn't existed since the victories in Manchuria a decade earlier. Admiral Osami Nagano's morning briefing had become a ritual of careful diplomatic maneuvering and calculated military posturing. At precisely 6:45 a.m., a naval communications officer burst through the mahogany doors without the customary bow, his white gloves clutching a decoded transmission that would validate 3 years of military planning. Or so they thought. The message from Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, was fragmentary but extraordinary. Attack successful. 8 battleships hit. Surprise complete. Minimal aircraft losses. Returning to base. Chief of Naval General Staff Nagano read the transmission twice, then looked up at the assembled officers. His first calculation was simple. If 8 American battleships were destroyed or damaged, the United States Pacific Fleet had effectively ceased to exist as an offensive force. The mathematics seemed decisive. America had 9 battleships assigned to Pearl Harbor. 8 confirmed hits meant 89% effectiveness. Japan's own naval losses in the attack appeared negligible, perhaps 20 or 30 aircraft out of 350 deployed. By 8 a.m., more detailed reports flooded the communications center. The scale of destruction exceeded even the most optimistic projections. USS Arizona obliterated by magazine explosion. USS Oklahoma capsized. USS California sinking. USS West Virginia hit by multiple torpedoes. USS Nevada beached. The American fighter defense had been caught completely unprepared. 188 aircraft destroyed on the ground, most never leaving their hangars. Vice Interior Minister Michio Yuzawa, who had attended Tojo's meeting with Emperor Hirohito the night before, documented that the emperor appeared at ease and unshakable when approving the war plan. This divine calm rippled through the military leadership. If the emperor showed no hesitation, how could they? But additional intelligence, arriving throughout the morning, told a different story, one that only a few officers had the strategic vision to recognize. Weather reconnaissance had reported the exact composition of American forces present at Pearl Harbor that morning. 9 battleships, 0 carriers, 0 The USS Enterprise had been scheduled to return to port on December 6th, but was delayed by storms. The USS Lexington was delivering aircraft to Midway Island. The USS Saratoga was in San Diego, undergoing refit. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the entire operation, received these reports aboard the Nagato with an expression his staff officers would later describe as gravely troubled. While Tokyo prepared victory celebrations, Yamamoto studied reconnaissance photographs that showed something his pilots had either missed or ignored. Massive cylindrical fuel storage tanks clustered along the harbor's northeastern edge, completely intact. Dry dock facilities showing minimal damage, machine shops and repair yards operating at full capacity. By noon, Tokyo time, as newspaper presses prepared special editions with 72-point headlines declaring great victory in Pacific, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo sat in his office reviewing diplomatic cables from Washington. President Roosevelt would address Congress within hours. American radio broadcasts monitored by intelligence suggested something unexpected. Instead of shock and demoralization, the American public response was trending toward unified outrage. The afternoon session of the Supreme War Council convened at 2 p.m. in the ornate conference room adjacent to the Emperor's chambers. Prime Minister Tojo entered carrying the morning's battle reports. He had waited his entire military career for this moment. Validation of Japan's military superiority over a Western power. The assembled ministers bowed deeply as he took his seat. "Gentlemen," Tojo began, his voice carrying the weight of achieved destiny, "we have struck a blow that will echo through history. The American Pacific Fleet has been crippled. Our forces have demonstrated superiority in planning, execution, and warrior spirit." General Hajime Sugiyama, Chief of the Army General Staff, presented the tactical analysis. The attack force had achieved surprise, destroyed primary targets, and withdrawn with acceptable losses. By every conventional metric, the operation was a masterpiece of military planning. But Admiral Nagano, the Navy's highest-ranking officer, raised a question that would haunt the next 6 months of strategy. The American carriers were not present at Pearl Harbor. Do we know their current locations? Naval Intelligence Officer Captain Kanji Ogawa spread tracking charts across the conference table. Enterprise, estimated position 200 miles west of Oahu, returning to port. Lexington, last known position near Midway Island, Saratoga, San Diego Naval Yard, all three operational, all three intact, all three now hunting the strike force. The room fell silent as the implications settled over them like morning fog. For years, naval doctrine had emphasized one principle above all others. Carrier forces represented the future of naval warfare. Battleships, while impressive, were becoming obsolete in an age of aircraft. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been designed specifically to eliminate America's carrier capacity in the Pacific. Instead, they had sunk 8 battleships, most of them built before 1920, while the modern carrier fleet escaped completely unscathed. Minister of War Hideki Tojo spoke next, his tone shifting from celebration to calculation. "If the carriers survive, then we must locate and destroy them before they can threaten our operations in Southeast Asia." Admiral Yamamoto's Chief of Staff, Matome Ugaki, had arrived from the Nagato specifically to brief the Supreme Council. His message was carefully worded but unmistakable. The attack achieved tactical success. Whether we have achieved strategic success depends entirely on what America does next. Foreign Minister Togo added the diplomatic dimension that military officers often overlooked. "President Roosevelt will address the American Congress in approximately 3 hours. Our ambassador in Washington reports that congressional leaders who opposed military intervention yesterday are now demanding immediate declarations of war. The surprise attack appears to have unified American public opinion in ways we did not anticipate." This was not how victory was supposed to feel. The numbers were extraordinary. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed, 2,400 enemy casualties, only 29 aircraft lost. But the strategic picture remained unclear. Yamamoto's warning from months earlier echoed in the minds of those few officers who had heard it. I can run wild for 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second and third years. By evening, as Tokyo's streets filled with celebration and citizens waved flags beneath lanterns proclaiming the emperor's divine destiny, a smaller gathering took place aboard the Nagato. Admiral Yamamoto convened his senior staff officers for an assessment that would not be shared with Tokyo. He spread intelligence reports across the wardroom table, assessments of American industrial capacity, steel production figures, oil reserves, and shipbuilding schedules. The numbers told a story that contradicted every newspaper headline being printed in Tokyo. "Gentlemen," Yamamoto said quietly, "we have won a great tactical victory today, but I want you to understand what we have also done. We have given America a reason to mobilize their entire industrial capacity against us. Every factory, every shipyard, every resource will now be directed at our destruction." One of his staff officers protested, "Admiral, we have crippled their Pacific fleet. They cannot threaten us for months, perhaps years." Yamamoto pulled out a folder containing research he had compiled during his time studying at Harvard and serving as naval attaché in Washington. America produced 4.6 million automobiles last year. Their steel production exceeds ours by a factor of 12 to 1. Their oil reserves are effectively unlimited compared to our current stocks. They can replace every ship we sank today and build 10 more within 18 months. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Japan had approximately 6.3 million barrels of oil in reserve, enough for perhaps 18 months of military operations at current consumption rates. The planned conquests in Southeast Asia would add to this, but American submarines were already being positioned to interdict those supply lines. "The carriers we missed today," Yamamoto continued, "will be hunting us within weeks. We must locate and destroy them before America's industrial machine fully awakens. If we fail, everything we achieved at Pearl Harbor will prove meaningless." His prediction would prove devastatingly accurate. 6 months later, at a small atoll called Midway, 4 aircraft carriers, including Akagi and Kaga, which had struck Pearl Harbor, would be sent to the bottom of the Pacific in a single day. The celebration of December 8th, 1941, would be revealed as Japan's final moment of strategic confidence before the long descent into defeat. But to understand how Japan's leadership could celebrate so completely while simultaneously sealing their fate, one must first understand the carefully constructed beliefs that had shaped their strategic thinking for more than a decade. These beliefs, documented in countless military assessments and strategic planning sessions, would all prove catastrophically wrong. But on December 8th, 1941, as champagne flowed through the halls of the Imperial General Headquarters, most of Japan's leaders still believed them completely. The celebration was real. The tactical victory was undeniable, but so was the underlying truth that only a few clear-eyed officers recognized in their moment of triumph. They had not merely attacked Pearl Harbor, they had awakened an industrial giant that would spend the next 4 years methodically dismantling everything Japan had built. To understand how Japan's high command could simultaneously celebrate and doom their nation on the same day, we must go back to the years of strategic assumptions, intelligence assessments, and carefully cultivated illusions that brought them to this moment. The morning of December 8th, 1941, transformed Tokyo into a city suspended between history and destiny. By 9:30 a.m., massive crowds had already gathered outside the Imperial Diet Building, their faces turned upward toward the imposing stone facade as if awaiting divine pronouncement. Newspaper vendors rushed through the streets with special editions still wet from the presses, their headlines declaring in 72-point type, "Great Victory in Pacific." Inside the Diet Chamber, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo stood in an antechamber, adjusting his military uniform with meticulous precision. Each medal, each insignia, carried the weight of decades spent climbing through the ranks of imperial military bureaucracy. But this morning was different from every morning that had preceded it. Today, He would announce to the world that Japan had struck the first blow in what he believed would be Asia's war of liberation. The previous night returned to him in fragments as he prepared. The walk through the imperial palace gardens, cherry trees, skeletal against the winter sky. Emperor Hirohito's private chamber, austere despite its ceremonial function. The emperor's face, composed and serene as Tojo had outlined the final preparations for war. "Your Majesty," Tojo had said, bowing so low his forehead nearly touched the tatami mats. "Given the current situation, we have practically won already. The Americans cannot match our resolve." Hirohito had said little, his divine status requiring him to remain above the passionate declarations of his ministers. But his nod, slight and deliberate, had carried the force of absolute approval. That single gesture had released Tojo from any lingering doubt. If the living God showed no hesitation, how could mortal men question the path ahead? At precisely 10 o'clock a.m., Tojo entered the diet chamber to thunderous applause. Every seat was filled. Representatives stood, their hands clapping in rhythmic unison that seemed to shake the chamber's ornate ceiling. Some openly wept, overcome by emotions they had suppressed through years of diplomatic frustration and international humiliation. The applause continued for 3 full minutes before Tojo raised his hand for silence. "Honored representatives," he began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of practiced authority. "This morning, our imperial forces have struck a decisive blow against the forces of Western imperialism that have long sought to strangle our divine nation." The chamber erupted again. Tojo waited, then continued. "At Pearl Harbor, in the Hawaiian Islands, our Navy has crippled the American Pacific Fleet, 8 battleships destroyed or damaged, hundreds of aircraft eliminated. Our losses minimal, our resolve absolute." The Emperor's rescript was read aloud by the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, each character pronounced with ceremonial precision. The document framed the conflict not as aggression, but as necessary self-defense, Japan's divine mission to free Asia from the colonial powers that had exploited the continent for centuries. Representatives listened with heads bowed, some trembling with the weight of the moment. Outside the main chamber, in the marble corridors where protocol allowed for less formal gatherings, a cluster of high-ranking naval officers discussed what the newspapers were not yet printing. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi, known for his meticulous attention to tactical details, spoke quietly to his colleagues. 29 aircraft, lost out of 350 deployed. The ratio is unprecedented." Admiral Shigetaro Shimada nodded slowly. "The Americans were caught completely unprepared. We achieved total surprise." "But," Onishi let the word hang in the air between them. "But," another officer prompted. "But surprise can only be achieved once," Onishi finished. "They are awake now." What Admiral Shimada understood in that moment, and what Tokyo's celebrating generals would take weeks to discover, was that they had started a clock counting down to confrontation with forces they could not control. The celebration in the chamber continued, drowning out such quiet concerns. Delegates called for Japan to press forward, to seize the momentum, to drive Western influence from Asia entirely. The emotional crescendo seemed to lift the very building, as if collective will alone could reshape the world's balance of power. 3,000 miles away, aboard the flagship Nagato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat at his desk in the flag officer's cabin. The room was sparse, functional, a reflection of his personality. Before him lay a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with careful observations and strategic calculations accumulated over decades of naval service. He dipped his pen in ink and began to write, his characters precise despite the gentle roll of the ship. "We have achieved tactical success beyond expectation. The enemy's battleships lie broken in their harbor. Our losses are negligible by any measure. Tokyo celebrates." Yamamoto paused, pen hovering above paper. Through the porthole, he could see the grey expanse of the Pacific endless and indifferent to human ambition. He thought of his years in America, the vast factories of Detroit, the oil fields of Texas stretching to the horizon, the university libraries filled with technical journals, documenting industrial innovations Japan could not hope to match. He continued writing, "I fear we have not won a war today. We have merely started a clock counting down to our defeat. The Americans will come for us with every ship they can build, every aircraft they can produce, every soldier they can mobilize, and we will face this onslaught with limited resources, an industrial base, a fraction of theirs, and the knowledge that every passing month strengthens them while weakening us." He sat down the pen and closed the journal, tucking it into his desk drawer. Above deck, his officers celebrated their unprecedented success. In Tokyo, the Diet session was concluding with renewed pledges of loyalty to the emperor and determination to see the war through to total victory. Newspapers were already being distributed throughout the city, their triumphant headlines declaring the dawn of a new era in Asian history. Yamamoto stood and walked to the porthole, watching the sun descend toward the western horizon, toward Hawaii, toward America, toward a future he alone seemed able to envision with clarity. The celebration was real. The victory was undeniable. But so was the truth he carried in silence. They had 6 months, perhaps less, before America's full industrial fury would be unleashed upon them. By early afternoon of December 8th, the underground war room beneath the Imperial General Headquarters had transformed into something resembling a victory festival. The space, typically governed by rigid military protocol and hushed efficiency, now buzzed with an energy that bordered on euphoric. Officers who had maintained stoic professionalism for months now permitted themselves genuine smiles. Junior staff members updated wall maps with red markers, each stroke documenting another American ship damaged or destroyed, another airfield rendered inoperative. Someone had produced bottles of sake and champagne, luxuries that had become increasingly scarce as military rationing intensified. The bottles passed from hand to hand, impromptu toasts erupting in corners of the room where senior officers gathered around tactical displays. "To the Emperor," one group declared, raising their cups. "To Admiral Yamamoto's brilliance," another responded. The clink of glass against glass punctuated conversations that ranged from tactical analysis to personal relief that years of planning had finally yielded tangible results. At 2:30 p.m., Admiral Osami Nagano convened the formal afternoon briefing. The assembled officers took their positions around the central planning table where a scale model of Pearl Harbor had been constructed with meticulous detail. Nagano's chief intelligence officer, Captain Yasuo Fujimori, stepped forward with a wooden pointer, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was reporting. "Gentlemen, the complete assessment from our strike force confirms the following results." Fujimori began tapping the model at specific points. Battleship Row, 8 capital ships hit, USS Arizona, magazine explosion, catastrophic damage, considered total loss, USS Oklahoma, capsized, likely unrecoverable, USS California, severe torpedo damage, sinking, USS West Virginia, multiple torpedo and bomb hits, sinking at moorings, USS Nevada, beached to prevent blocking harbor entrance, USS Pennsylvania, USS Maryland, USS Tennessee, varying degrees of damage, operational capacity severely reduced. The officers leaned forward, studying the model as Fujimori continued. Wheeler Field, Hickam Field, Kaneohe Naval Air Station, and Ewa Marine Corps Air Station, all struck with precision. 188 American aircraft destroyed, most on the ground before they could launch. Fighter defense response was negligible. Perhaps 7 or 8 aircraft managed to engage our strike force. Anti-aircraft fire, while initially scattered, became more effective in the second wave, accounting for most of our losses. Captain Minoru Genda, one of the operation's principal planners, interjected with barely contained satisfaction. "The Zero fighters performed beyond expectations. Our pilots report complete air superiority throughout the engagement." American fighters that did manage to take off were consistently outmaneuvered. The Zero's range, speed, and maneuverability gave us advantages the Americans clearly did not anticipate. Fujimori nodded and continued with casualty figures. American personnel losses currently estimated at 2,400 killed with approximately 1,200 wounded. These numbers far exceed our projections. The concentration of personnel aboard the battleships at the time of attack created casualty rates we had not dared hope for. He paused, then added the comparison that made the achievement seem even more remarkable. Our losses: 29 aircraft, 5 submarines, and 64 personnel. The exchange ratio is approximately 40-1 in our favor. The room remained silent for a moment, as if the officers needed time to process the sheer magnitude of their success. Then Admiral Nagano spoke, his voice carrying the weight of his position as Chief of Naval General Staff. "Gentlemen, this operation will be studied in military academies for generations. The planning, the execution, the courage of our pilots, all have brought honor to the Emperor and vindication to our nation's cause. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. At 4:00 p.m., a formal delegation departed the war room to brief Emperor Hirohito at the Imperial Palace. Admiral Nagano led the group, carrying leather folders containing detailed reports and reconnaissance photographs. The Emperor received them in his private study, a room whose simplicity contrasted sharply with the ornate ceremonial spaces elsewhere in the palace. He listened without interruption as Nagano presented the results, his expression maintaining the serene composure that his divine status required. When the briefing concluded, Hirohito spoke softly. The operation proceeded as planned. "Yes, Your Majesty," Nagano responded. "The execution was flawless. Our forces have struck a blow that will resonate throughout the Pacific." The Emperor nodded once, a gesture that, while minimal, carried immense significance. His approval rippled back through the military hierarchy like an electric current. By evening, every officer in the Imperial General Headquarters knew that the living God had blessed their achievement. The morale boost was immeasurable. Yet, even as celebrations continued into the night, certain conversations unfolded in quieter corners of the war room. Commander Yasuji Watanabe, a naval intelligence specialist who had spent years tracking American fleet movements, stood before a plotting table with 2 colleagues, studying reconnaissance reports with growing concern. "The carrier positions," Watanabe said quietly, tapping a map of the Pacific with his finger. "Enterprise was scheduled to be in port. Our intelligence indicated she would return on December 6th. Weather delay pushed her arrival to the 8th, Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Omai replied, 1 day after our attack. And Lexington, Saratoga. Lexington was delivering aircraft to Midway, Saratoga in San Diego for refit, both assignments documented in our intelligence reports weeks ago. But the timing. Watanabe's voice trailed off, his implication clear. 3 carriers, all absent, all of them America's most valuable offensive assets. A 3rd officer, Captain Kameto Kuroshima, joined them. The 3 men stood in silence, the background noise of celebration seeming suddenly distant. Watanabe finally articulated what they were all thinking. "We destroyed their battleships, but battleships are defensive weapons, garrison forces, carriers project power, carriers hunt, and we did not sink a single one." Kuroshima glanced toward the main briefing area where senior officers continued toasting their success. "Should we raise this concern with Admiral Nagano?" Watanabe considered, then shook his head slowly. "Not tonight. Tonight belongs to celebration. Tomorrow we can discuss what it means that America's 3 most dangerous warships remain operational and are now undoubtedly hunting us." The sake continued to flow. Officers exchanged stories of where they were when the first reports arrived, what they thought when they saw the damage assessments, how they felt witnessing Japan finally assert itself against Western power. The maps on the walls showed a tactical masterpiece, The casualty ratios suggested military genius. The emperor's approval confirmed divine favor. But in the corner, 3 intelligence officers studied carrier position reports and tried to calculate where the USS Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga might be at this exact moment and what they might do once they received orders to respond. The flag officer's cabin aboard the Nagato existed in a world apart from the celebrations sweeping through Tokyo. While champagne flowed in the Imperial General Headquarters and citizens danced in the streets, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat alone at his desk, surrounded by reconnaissance photographs that told a story his nation refused to hear. The images lay spread before him in neat rows, each one documenting the attack's devastating precision. Battleship Row, captured from 3,000 feet. The Arizona's shattered hull. The Oklahoma's capsized form. The California settling into the harbor mud. Wheeler Field, photographed in the aftermath. Aircraft torn apart, hangars burning, runways cratered. The tactical execution was flawless. Every photograph confirmed what Tokyo already believed. Japan had achieved a military masterpiece, but Yamamoto's attention kept returning to 3 other photographs, images his reconnaissance pilots had captured almost as afterthoughts: empty berths where carriers should have been moored, vacant slips at Ford Island, the Enterprise's designated anchorage, photographed at 8:15 a.m. Hawaiian time, showing only open water reflecting the morning sky. He picked up the intelligence summary again, though he had already memorized every line. Carrier strength at Pearl Harbor, 0. USS Enterprise, delayed by weather. Estimated arrival, Pearl Harbor evening, December 8th. USS Lexington. Last confirmed, position vicinity, Midway Island. USS Saratoga, San Diego Naval Yard. Refit status, 3 words, appeared in red ink at the summary's bottom. Carriers not present. Yamamoto sat down the document and closed his eyes. The phrase echoed in his mind with the persistence of a temple bell. Carriers not present. The Americans' 3 most valuable warships, their offensive power, their ability to project force across thousands of miles of ocean, all survived, all operational, all now hunting the strike force that had bloodied their nation. His mind drifted backward to a different time, when he had walked American streets as a student rather than an enemy. Harvard University, 1919. He could still recall the smell of autumn leaves in Harvard Yard, the weight of textbooks under his arm, the earnest debates with American classmates about naval strategy and international relations. They had treated him with respect. These Americans, they had welcomed a foreign officer into their institutions, shared their knowledge freely, assumed that understanding between nations was not only possible, but inevitable. He had toured their factories during that assignment, vast industrial complexes that stretched for miles. The Ford River Rouge plant in Detroit, when automobiles rolled off assembly lines with mechanical precision, 1 vehicle every minute. Steel mills in Pittsburgh that glowed day and night, their furnaces fed by trainloads of ore that arrived in endless succession. Oil refineries in Texas that processed more petroleum in a single day than Japan's entire annual production. His American hosts had been proud of these accomplishments, eager to show their industrial capacity to the visiting Japanese naval officer. They had not realized, could not have realized, that they were showing him the instruments of their own future victory. Yamamoto had taken careful notes, compiled statistics, and returned to Japan with a clear understanding. America's industrial capacity exceeded Japan's by orders of magnitude that made conventional military comparison almost meaningless. In 1940, when war planning had begun in earnest, Yamamoto had tried to communicate this reality to the political leadership. He had stood before the Navy Ministry and delivered his assessment with characteristic bluntness. If ordered to fight, I can run wild for 6 months, or perhaps a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd years. The ministers had nodded solemnly, but Yamamoto had seen in their eyes that they did not truly understand. They heard his warning as modesty, as the careful hedging of a cautious strategist. They did not grasp that he was stating a mathematical certainty. A knock at the cabin door interrupted his reverie. His chief of staff, Matome Ugaki, entered with fresh intelligence reports. Admiral, the preliminary damage assessment has been updated. The Americans have confirmed the Arizona as a total loss. Our aircraft losses remain at 29. The ratio continues to exceed all projections. Yamamoto nodded, accepting the documents without enthusiasm. Ugaki lingered, perhaps expecting some expression of satisfaction or strategic insight. When none came, he ventured carefully. The staff assumes you are already planning our next operations, the seizure of Wake Island, the Philippines campaign. Leave me, Yamamoto said quietly. I need to think. Ugaki bowed and departed, closing the door with a soft click. Through the cabin's porthole, Yamamoto could see the sunset, painting the Pacific in shades of red and gold, beautiful and indifferent. His officers assumed he was planning the next phase of conquest. They imagined him calculating how to press Japan's advantage, how to consolidate the victory, how to force America to the negotiating table before their industrial machine could fully mobilize. They did not understand that he was doing something far different. He was calculating how long Japan could survive once America's full fury was unleashed. He was estimating how many months before American shipyards began launching carriers faster than Japan could sink them. He was projecting how long before American factories produced so many aircraft that Japanese pilots, no matter how skilled, no matter how brave, would simply be overwhelmed by numerical superiority. 6 months, he had warned them. Perhaps a year. He had been precise in his prediction, not because he was pessimistic, but because he had done the mathematics. American steel production, 12 times Japan's capacity. American oil reserves, effectively unlimited compared to Japan's meager stocks. American population, twice Japan's, with industrial infrastructure to mobilize that population into a military force that would dwarf anything Japan could field. The attack on Pearl Harbor had not changed these fundamental realities. It had merely started the clock counting down to their inevitable conclusion. Japan had landed the first blow, achieved surprise, inflicted tremendous damage, and in doing so, they had guaranteed that America, a nation that might have remained neutral, that might have focused its attention on the European war, would now direct its complete industrial and military capacity toward Japan's destruction. Yamamoto opened his journal and began to write, his characters flowing with practiced precision. We have awakened something that we lack the power to defeat. The Americans will come for us with every ship they can build, every aircraft they can produce, every soldier they can mobilize, and we will face this onslaught with limited resources, an industrial base, a fraction of theirs, and the knowledge that every passing month strengthens them while weakening us. He paused, pen hovering above paper, then added one final observation. Today, Tokyo celebrates our greatest victory. I pray I live long enough to see whether history judges us as brilliant strategists or as the architects of our own destruction. The carriers we miss today will be our judges. Outside his cabin, junior officers moved through the Nagato's corridors with purpose and pride, their nation's triumph validating years of training and sacrifice. They did not know that their commander sat alone in the darkness, staring at photographs of empty harbor berths, calculating the cost of a victory that had solved nothing. The morning of December 9th brought a different quality of light to the Imperial General Headquarters war room. The champagne bottles had been cleared away. The impromptu celebrations concluded. Officers returned to their stations with a professional focus that military routine demanded, ready to analyze what had been accomplished and plan what would come next. But the intelligence reports arriving throughout the early hours carried information that would fundamentally alter how the previous day's triumph was understood. Captain Yasuo Fujimori entered the war room at 7:00 a.m., carrying aerial reconnaissance photographs taken during the attack's final minutes. He spread them across the analysis table where senior staff officers gathered for the morning briefing. The images showed Pearl Harbor from various angles and altitudes, documenting not just what had been destroyed, but what remained intact. "Gentlemen," Fujimori began, his voice carrying none of yesterday's satisfaction, "we have completed detailed assessment of infrastructure damage at Pearl Harbor. The results are concerning." He pointed to a series of cylindrical structures clearly visible along the harbor's northeastern edge. "These are the fuel storage tanks, massive above-ground installations containing the Pacific Fleet's petroleum reserves. Intelligence estimates place their capacity at 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil, gasoline, and aviation fuel." He paused, letting the number register, then delivered the critical assessment. Not a single tank was targeted during the attack. All remained fully operational. The room fell silent. Commander Yasuji Watanabe leaned forward, studying the photographs with intensity. 4.5 million barrels. That's enough to fuel the entire Pacific Fleet for approximately 18 months of sustained operations. Fujimori finished. Without those reserves, the American fleet would have been forced to withdraw to the west coast for refueling. Every operation in the Pacific would have required supply lines stretching back to California refineries. The strategic impact would have been immeasurable. Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, chief of the operations section, examined additional photographs showing the naval yard facilities. The dry docks stood largely undamaged, their massive pumping systems and repair infrastructure clearly visible. Machine shops showed superficial damage, but remained structurally sound. The submarine base, protected by its position at the harbor's entrance, had been virtually untouched. "The repair facilities," Fukudome said slowly, "can restore damaged ships to operational status. The battleships we sank in shallow water, California, West Virginia, even the capsized Oklahoma, could potentially be salvaged and rebuilt. With these facilities intact, the Americans have not lost their naval yard capacity. They have only lost time." Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Omae pulled out technical specifications his intelligence team had compiled on Pearl Harbor's industrial infrastructure. "The Navy Yard employs approximately 4,000 civilian workers. Their capacity includes complete ship overhauls, major repairs, and modifications. During the attack, our pilots focused on vessels and aircraft. The industrial heart of Pearl Harbor was never prioritized." By mid-morning, the debate that would define naval strategic analysis for months had begun in earnest. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's decision to withdraw the strike force after 2 waves, foregoing a planned 3rd wave that could have targeted infrastructure, became the focus of intense scrutiny. Admiral Nagano convened a special session at 10 o'clock a.m., specifically to address the question. "Nagumo faced tactical considerations we must acknowledge," argued Captain Minoru Genda, who had helped plan the operation. "American air defenses were strengthening. Fighter patrols were launching from surviving airfields. Our pilots reported increasing anti-aircraft accuracy. Most critically, the location of American carriers remained unknown. A 3rd wave would have required our strike force to remain in dangerous waters for additional hours, potentially exposing our carriers to counterattack." Admiral Fukudome countered with strategic logic. "But without destroying the fuel reserves and repair facilities, we have achieved a tactical victory that lacks strategic permanence. We have wounded the American fleet, not eliminated it. The difference is fundamental." The debate continued through lunch, with officers divided between supporting Nagumo's caution and questioning whether fear of carrier counterattack had prevented complete victory. Intelligence Officer Watanabe presented calculations showing that destroying the fuel tanks alone would have forced American operations to depend on vulnerable tanker convoys crossing thousands of miles of ocean, targets for submarine interdiction. "We had an opportunity," Watanabe stated carefully, "to not merely damage American naval power, but to fundamentally disrupt their capacity to project force in the Pacific. That opportunity was not taken." By afternoon, Admiral Matome Ugaki had returned to the Nagato and was updating his personal diary, a meticulous record he maintained of naval operations and strategic assessments. His entry for December 9th captured the growing unease that technical analysis had revealed. "Yesterday's triumph now appears more complex under scrutiny. We achieved tactical brilliance in execution. The surprise was complete. The damage to vessels exceeded expectations. Our losses were minimal, but strategic uncertainty clouds these achievements. The carriers escaped. The fuel reserves remain. The repair capacity survives. We have struck the American fleet, but have not eliminated its capacity to rebuild and counterattack. He set down his pen and looked out across the grey waters surrounding the flagship. In Tokyo, newspapers still proclaimed unqualified victory. The public celebrated Japan's military prowess. But here, in the quiet analysis of professional naval officers, a different picture was emerging. They had achieved perhaps 70% of a perfect attack. In most military operations, such success would be celebrated without reservation. But Pearl Harbor was not most operations. It was intended to be decisive, a blow so devastating that America would be forced to negotiate rather than fight. Instead, they had created a wounded enemy with intact infrastructure and unlimited industrial capacity to heal those wounds. The fuel to power a counteroffensive sat in undamaged tanks. The facilities to repair damaged ships remained operational. The submarine base could support harassment operations against Japanese supply lines. And somewhere in the Pacific, 3 American carriers roamed free, their aviators undoubtedly burning with desire for revenge. The evening briefing at Imperial General Headquarters concluded with Admiral Nagano's careful summary. Gentlemen, we have achieved a significant tactical victory. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed represents a major blow to American naval power in the Pacific. However, we must now turn our attention to consolidating this advantage before the Americans can recover and respond. But several officers left the briefing with a realization they could not yet articulate publicly. Recovery might come faster than anyone anticipated. The Americans had not lost their Pacific naval base. They had merely suffered casualties at that base. The infrastructure that made Pearl Harbor strategically valuable remained intact. The fuel reserves that enabled operations remained untapped. The industrial capacity that could restore damaged vessels remained functional. Commander Watanabe stood alone in the war room after the briefing concluded, studying the reconnaissance photographs in the dim light. The fuel tanks were clearly visible in multiple images, their distinctive cylindrical shapes unmistakable. Any pilot could have identified them. Any attack coordinator could have assigned them as targets. But in the focus on ships and aircraft, on spectacular visible destruction, the mundane infrastructure that actually sustained naval operations had been ignored. He picked up one particular photograph showing the battleship Nevada beached at the harbor entrance, smoke still rising from her superstructure. Beyond the ship, clearly visible in the background, stood rows of undamaged fuel tanks, the image captured in a single frame, both the triumph and the failure of December 7th. Dramatic destruction in the foreground, strategic oversight in the background. The American Pacific Fleet would rebuild, not someday, not eventually, soon. And when it did, those fuel tanks would power its return. The Naval Intelligence Section occupied a sealed room 2 floors beneath the Imperial General Headquarters main operations center. On the morning of December 10th, 3 days after the attack, this windowless space had become the focus of increasingly urgent attention. Commander Yasuji Watanabe stood before a wall-sized map of the Pacific, colored pins marking every known American naval asset. 3 pins, red indicating carrier-class vessels, dominated his attention and increasingly troubled his sleep. "Enterprise," he said, tapping the first pin positioned approximately 200 miles west of Oahu. "Confirmed sighting by our reconnaissance aircraft on the evening of December 8th, returning to Pearl Harbor. She was scheduled to arrive December 6th, but was delayed by weather conducting aircraft delivery to Wake Island. Current status: operational, undamaged, air wing intact." Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Omae updated his tracking log, a detailed ledger documenting American fleet movements, compiled from radio intercepts, reconnaissance reports, and intelligence assessments. Last confirmed position places her entering Pearl Harbor, late evening, December 8th. Her crew witnessed the harbor devastation firsthand. Intelligence suggests extreme emotional response among personnel. Watanabe moved to the second pin. Lexington, Task Force 12, commanded by Rear Admiral John Newton. Mission: deliver Marine aircraft to Midway Island. Last confirmed position December 7th placed her approximately 420 miles southeast of Midway. She was nowhere near Pearl Harbor during our attack. He paused, calculating distances and transit times. Current estimated position: returning toward Hawaiian waters. Operational, undamaged, actively searching for our strike force. The third pin sat off the California coast. Saratoga, San Diego Naval Yard, undergoing scheduled refit and modernization. Intelligence indicates she was preparing for Pearl Harbor deployment when war was declared. Estimated time to operational readiness, 72 to 96 hours. Once deployed, she joins Enterprise and Lexington as active threats in our operational area. Captain Kanji Ogawa, Chief of Naval Intelligence Operations, studied the map with the intensity of a chess master, calculating multiple moves ahead. Three fleet carriers, combined air wings of approximately 240 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers. Each carrier represents more offensive striking power than any battleship we sank at Pearl Harbor, and all three now have explicit orders to hunt and destroy our forces. By mid-morning, the intelligence team had compiled scenarios for potential carrier operations. OMI presented their analysis to assembled staff officers. Scenario 1. Aggressive pursuit. American carriers attempt to locate and engage our strike force during its withdrawal. Probability, moderate. Our forces dispersed and maintaining radio silence. Detection would require either aerial reconnaissance or submarine contact. Scenario 2, he continued. Defensive posture around Hawaii. Carriers establish patrol patterns, protecting remaining assets and deterring follow-up attacks. Probability, high initially, declining as American command regains confidence. Scenario 3. Early offensive operations. Carriers conduct strikes against our forward positions. Wake Island, Marshall Islands, potentially even home waters. Probability increasing with time as American shock transforms into anger and desire for retaliation. The discussion shifted to tactical considerations. How would American carriers be employed? Would they operate independently or in task forces? What level of risk would American commanders accept in their desire for revenge? Captain Minoru Genda, whose expertise in carrier operations had helped plan the Pearl Harbor attack, offered assessment based on his study of American naval doctrine. The Americans train for carrier task force operations, Genda explained. They will not deploy vessels individually. Each carrier will have screening destroyers, cruisers for anti-aircraft defense, and likely submarine support. They think in terms of projected power rather than fleet. Engagements. These carriers will come for our installations, our supply lines, our forward bases. By afternoon, the intelligence summary reached Prime Minister Tojo's office. His response, delivered through the Navy Ministry, reflected the political optimism that had characterized his leadership since before the attack. The American carriers, while operational, represent no immediate strategic threat. Our forces control the initiative. We will locate and destroy them at a time of our choosing, just as we destroyed their battleships. The Navy Minister, reading Tojo's dismissal of carrier threats, chose his words carefully in response. Prime Minister, with respect, carriers are not battleships. They are mobile, they are fast, and they carry the means to strike at distances that exceed traditional naval engagement ranges. 3 operational carriers represent significant offensive capability. But Tojo's confidence, shaped by political imperatives and the need to maintain public morale, would not accommodate military caution. We have sunk 8 battleships. 3 carriers, even if they locate our forces, cannot alter the strategic balance we have achieved. 3,000 miles away aboard the Nagato, Admiral Yamamoto received the same intelligence reports with opposite interpretation. He called his senior staff to his cabin for a private briefing, one that would not be shared with Tokyo. The reconnaissance photographs and position estimates lay spread across his desk. These ships Yamamoto said quietly, will define the next phase of the war. Not the battleships we sank, not the aircraft we destroyed. These 3 carriers and whatever sisters America builds to join them. His chief of staff, Matome Ugaki, ventured carefully. Admiral, surely 3 carriers cannot threaten our combined fleet. No, Yamamoto replied, but consider what they represent. America has just suffered a humiliating defeat. Their territory has been attacked. Their ships have been sunk in their own harbor. How do you imagine they will respond? Yamamoto did not wait for an answer. They will build carriers. Many carriers. Their shipyards can produce vessels at rates we cannot match. Essex-class carriers are already under construction. I have seen the intelligence reports, each one larger, more capable than anything in our fleet. He picked up a photograph showing the empty berth where Enterprise should have been on December 7th. This empty space haunts me more than any ship we sank, because it represents American power we did not eliminate, and that power, I assure you, is coming for us. Commander Watanabe's evening intelligence update to Imperial General Headquarters carefully documented radio intercepts suggesting increased American fleet activity. Encrypted communications indicated task force formations, aerial reconnaissance patterns expanding outward from Hawaii, submarine deployments along suspected withdrawal routes. The Americans were not paralyzed by their defeat. They were mobilizing. The carriers are hunting, Watanabe reported to Admiral Nagano. Our strike force remains their primary target, but intelligence suggests they are also positioning to defend against follow-up attacks and potentially preparing early offensive operations. Nagano studied the positioning charts with experienced eyes. How long before they locate our carriers? Unknown, sir. The Pacific is vast, but the Americans have advantages we must acknowledge. They can operate from secure bases, they have reliable fuel supplies, and they are fighting in what they consider their own waters. Our advantage of surprise has been spent. Now we face determined adversaries who know our capabilities. That evening, in separate locations across the Pacific, 3 men wrote in private journals about the same concern. Yamamoto, aboard the Nagato. The carriers we missed will be our nemesis. Ugaki, in his detailed diary. The American carriers represent unfinished business that will cost us dearly. And Watanabe in his intelligence log. We sank the past at Pearl Harbor, but the future sailed away unharmed, and it is coming back. The 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, remained operational, their crews burning with rage and determination. Tokyo celebrated a victory measured in sunk battleships, but professional naval officers understood that modern naval war would not be decided by battleships. It would be decided by the carriers neither side could afford to lose, and Japan had just failed to sink a single one. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.